Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about standards of measurement and where they came from. I'm going to minimize my screen as well, so you don't have to look at me while I'm talking. So when we think about human-centered design, we focus on the people that you are designing for or with. Think of it as a system and look at all the components as everything is interconnected. Finding the right problem, the fundamental basic problem. And then always think about the big picture. What do you want somebody to do? What's the final result that we care about? So the starting point here is to understand, when did measurements of the human body become standardized and what are they? When did human behaviors and psychology become a consideration in relation to design? And when did we truly start accommodating for different bodies and abilities? To answer that, we have to go back to the 1400s, 1490 to be exact. We have Leonardo da Vinci, who created the Vitruvian Man based on the 10 books of architecture by Roman architect and engineer Marcus Vitruvius Pollio. Now, this was 20 to 30 BC. So we're talking a little over 2,000 years ago. Vitruvius thought architects should focus on three principles: strength, functionality, and beauty. And for beauty, he described the ideal proportions of the human figure and how that proportion can be used to create the perfect architecture. In other words, man is the measure of all things. Kind of biased there. So, on the right, you should see the Vitruvian Man. You might have seen this image before. In this image, you should see that the human body, the male human body, fits perfectly into a circle and into a square. And when the legs are spread, you should see a triangle as well, creating the perfect geometric units to create ideal spaces in architecture. And this became the standard for Western building aesthetics well into the 1900s. So this one image drawn in 1490 has impacted aesthetics for over 500 years. Craziness, craziness. The downside of this is that this was based on white European men. So if you were from a different geographic area of the world, you weren't included in this. If you were a female, you were not included in this. So I think it's important to highlight that here. So what I would like us to do, or what I would like you to do, and jot this down and bring it to class with you next class. What I'd like you to do is pause the video, and I want you to do some measuring. So grab a measuring tape, grab your ruler or whatever, and jot these measurements down. Okay, so I'm here. So idealized proportions according to Vitruvius. 4 fingers equals 1 palm. Well, no duh, right? 4 fingers equals 1 palm. But that's not what he's saying here, right? I mean, put your fingers together and then measure. And you kind of want to measure probably at your bottom knuckle, right? From top to bottom. And you want to get that measurement. That will stand as the foundational measurement for your palm, for a foot, for a cubit, for your height, and then your pace. And a pace is when you're standing and you take 1 step, 2 steps, and your feet come back together. That's 1 pace. So pause the video, find a ruler, measure your fingers, And then write down the measurements for your palm: 1 foot, 1 cubit, your height, and then 1 pace. And when you do that, see if those measurements are actually correct. We'll talk about it in class. So go ahead, pause the video and do some measuring. Okay, welcome back. How did that pan out? Did it actually relate, or were things slightly off? Again, we'll talk about this in class, but bring your measurements in. So the 10 books of architecture, they were quite widely used and respected throughout history. And I wanted to show you an example of where the proportions were applied. So this is an ideal city plan for Zinda, Milan. And this was created by architect Antonio di Pietro Avellino, which I'm pretty sure I butchered that name. But as you can see here, on the left, the black and white diagram, you see the circle, right? The circle that man fits into. Within that circle, you see, or you should see, that there's 2 squares. One square is exactly like it was in the Vitruvian Man illustration. The second square is duplicated and turned so that you have this kind of Lisa Simpson-like silhouette to it. And then in the middle of this circle is the center of the town, much like in the center of the Vitruvian Man, you have the navel. So here you have the center of town, and then it radiates out. You have the 2 squares, rotated a little bit. And this was the ideal city plan. Never built, so take that for what it's worth. But this is one of the ways that idealized proportions were applied to city planning. So now we need to kind of move into the 1900s. Now, I know this is quite a leap from 1490 to 1900, but there wasn't a lot of movement in terms of body measurements or documentation of that was used for architecture between 1490 and the mid-1900s. So 1929 to 2006, Henry Dreyfuss and Associates was a prolific industrial design firm founded by Henry Dreyfuss here on the right. Henry Dreyfuss was inspired by Albrecht Dürer and his 4 books on human proportions. He was also inspired by Da Vinci and the Vitruvian Man. Now, Dreyfuss was also interested in anthropometry, human factors, and human engineering. Anthropometry is the scientific study of the measurements and proportions of the human body. Human factors encompass both physiology and psychology and covers most factors affecting human performance of tasks using tools or in man-made environments. Human engineering is the application of knowledge about human beings' relationship to design. So I put some extra additional resources here on the page if you want to dive into this just a little bit more. So throughout his time, or throughout his career, he published many books, and bodily measurement standards. So, on the show, Henry Dreyfuss, Designing for People, fabulous book. The Measure of Man and Woman, again, which is where Joe and Josephine came from, the original personas. And then throughout his career, he developed manuals called Human Scale. And these documented ideal measurements for sizes of people, sitting considerations, requirements for the handicapped and elderly. I don't like that word handicap, but that's what they published. Human strength and safety, controls and displays, designing for people, standing and sitting at work, space planning for the individual and the public, and access for maintenance, stairs, light, and color. Really fun. I will bring those out when we're in class, and I will show you how they all work. Really fun. So, the Human Scale Manual. This was a compilation of body measurements that was published in 1974, with men's measurements coming from the military and women's measurements coming from the fashion industry. So you can imagine between 1940 and 1960, the lack of diversity in these measurements. So again, we're looking at this 70 years later. So our bodies have gotten a little bit wider. They've gotten a little bit taller. They might have gotten a little bit shorter. Might have gotten a little bit thinner. But this became a template for Henry Dreyfuss to then design spaces, to design buildings, to design spaces that humans would interact with. So this is the next goalpost in standardization of human measurements, body measurements anyway. So in this, there's consideration for height, but not so much a consideration for width. So as Henry Dreyfuss and his associates were designing objects, industrial objects, they would use Joe and Josephine as personas. Kind of fun, right? With his interest in anthropometry, human factors, and human engineering, the New York Central Railroad launched an experiment to enhance its passenger traffic in the Midwest. The goal was a new streamlined service focusing on speed and innovation. Mercury, it was named, the name of the Roman god of messengers, was chosen for its connotations of speed and marketed as the train of tomorrow. Final designs were approved, but when sent out for bids, the cost was astronomical and the project was canceled. Frustrated, Henry took a train out to the country, and when he passed the rail yards of Mott Haven, he had an idea to convert the used railroad cars that were just sitting there into the designs he created. This wound up being a quarter of the price of the original bids, and the company agreed. These were the first streamlined railroad cars designed as a unit, inside and out, integrating everything from the locomotive to dinner china. Recreating the atmosphere of a private club, he paid special attention to humans and their needs while traveling. Something of note here for the locomotive, he covered the exterior pipes, whistles, and other fittings into a smooth bathtub shape with cutouts to show the wheels. And just for fun, he illuminated the wheel area. So at nighttime, when this train was going across the country or across the landscape, you'd be able to see that the wheels are lit. It's kind of fun, kind of fun. In 1953, he was hired by the military as anthropometry and human factors came in very handy for the military. This helped to determine the sizes of equipment used by soldiers, such as uniforms, helmets, tank, and bomber cockpits. tank and bomber cockpits. Up to this point in history, making the machine was more important, and people had to adapt to the machine. Henry was about fitting the machine to man for more efficient and comfortable use. And he's quoted as saying, the most effective machine is the one built around a person. He used Joe to redesign the cramped driver's compartment of a tank with fixed dimensions. By rapid prototyping models and user testing them, they incorporated the human into the design, a pioneering effort. They changed the interior color to gray-green to reduce fatigue and glare. They relocated controls within easy reach of the operator and created different size knobs and handles to differentiate controls in dim lighting. So a really fantastic example of how he was focusing in on human needs as well as body measurements to solve a problem. Bell telephones, I don't need to talk about this. You should have read this in Beautiful Users, so there's no need for me to go over it again. Over the years, he worked with John Deere tractor as well, so that's a fun Iowa connection. He worked on many projects with John Deere, from hay choppers to rakes, to stationary to engines, and he even worked on the famous leaping deer trademark. He styled the new look of their tractors to bring out the impression of ruggedness and strength, paying close attention to how a user would actually use the machine. So on the right, if you can see, there's a padded seat with lumbar support. In prior tractor designs, the seat was metal and there was no back support. On the left, you see a dashboard with clearly marked levers and a car-like steering wheel, making it very easy to operate this machine. When you look at his work, he had a strong understanding of form, color, line, space, sculpture, design, human measurements, and behavior, a beautiful combination of art and design principles, which makes me so excited to share him with you, because I think that a designer should be able to design anything, not just brochures or logos or identity. And if you understand and apply the principles of art and design, you can actually design anything. All right, one more example. The Hoover vacuum cleaner. Henry also worked with the Hoover Corporation as well. Using Josephine as a persona, he developed this design. The mechanical workings were completely concealed from sight by a Bakelite cover, and Bakelite is just plastic. Plastic was invented in 1907. The cover was a teardrop style shell, which seamlessly incorporated the headlight for greater visibility while cleaning. So he thought about that. Also, he totally revamped the base of the machine. Since the release of this design, all Hoover cleaners consisted of a fluid base and a hood to cover the electric motor. These designs suggested efficiency, cleanliness, and speed. Dreyfus brought excitement and style to an otherwise mundane household appliance. And he did a good job. The Hoover Corporation sold over 2 million of these vacuums between 1946 and 1950. So when you look at this vacuum, it looks pretty simple, and you may or may not have seen this in your family's houses or grandparents' houses. But think about the ergonomics of this. Think about how tall the handle is in relation to a person's body. Think about the width of the handle and the grip that you would need in order to use this. Think about how you incorporate, or how he incorporated, the storage for the power cord. Think about how he designed the access to the bag, right? These are all things that need human consideration when building. So around this time, mid-late 1500 or 1950s, independent living comes into focus. Our GIs are coming home from war injured, And the polio epidemic led to a focus on disability rights, or the independent living movement. So, more diverse bodies and needs are being recognized and seen in public. And this is starting to become more normalized during this time. The reason I bring this up is that bodies and needs are changing. These bodies are in wheelchairs. They have 800-pound iron lungs that they need to live in. They have motorized wheelchairs. And up until this point, the environment that is built is not very accommodating for these needs. On the right is Judith Heumann. In 1949, she contracted polio and has been in a wheelchair since then. Her goal in life is to continue to advance the rights and empowerment of all disabled people around the world. If you're interested, you can follow her on Twitter at Judith Heumann. She has a podcast, I believe, The Human Perspective. And she was also in a movie called Crip Camp, and that is on Netflix. Highly recommend that you watch that. In 1968, accessibility gains momentum. So this focuses on the physical design of buildings and facilities on the job, which is the #1 barrier to employment. This act requires that all buildings designed, constructed, altered, or leased with federal funds be made accessible. So on screen, if you look on the bottom, we see that there are stairs, but there's a ramp that goes through those stairs. And the ramp is at an appropriate angle, so if somebody was actually pushing a wheelchair up the ramp, they would be able to do it under their own power. Next to that are curb cuts. These are something that are almost ubiquitous now. Like you go to a street corner and you look for the curb cut to walk down into the crosswalk to get across the street. On the right is Ed Roberts. He contracted polio in 1953 at 14 years old. He's the father of the independent living movement. And I believe he was in Crip Camp as well. Let's see. And, at any point during this lecture, I do encourage you to pause the video and do some quick Google searches on every slide that I'm presenting, especially if you're interested in hearing more. So in 1973, disability rights movement emerges. This only applied to programs that run with federal financial assistance, though. However, it did essentially pave the way for the ADA of 1990. On the right is Justin Dart Jr. He contracted polio in 1948 and has been a wheelchair user ever since. In the early 80s, him and his wife, Yoshiko, traveled around the US collecting stories of hardships of disabled people to create legislation that would address discrimination against people with disabilities. He used these stories to construct the ADA, so he is often called the father of the ADA, which is the American with Disabilities Act. So the ADA now applies to private as well as public-facing institutions. And some examples of these accommodations are physical changes, so modifying a restroom to accommodate for wheelchairs and other assistive devices, which can be extensions of bodies, modifying the layout of a workspace, using video phones to facilitate communications with colleagues who are deaf, providing sign language interpreters or closed captioning at meetings and events, policy enhancements, modifying a policy to allow a service animal in the business setting, or adjusting work schedules so employees with chronic medical conditions can go to medical appointments and complete their work at alternate times or locations. In architecture, curb cuts to sidewalks and entrances, automated doors with opening buttons, and also rules on how much pressure needs to be exerted to open and close them, along with the speed of them opening and closing. These are all things that we just don't even think about and we take for granted. Also, widening doors to accommodate for wheelchairs and other assistive devices. So really, this is the focus and incorporation of those with different abilities and needs into society or into the built environment. 1999, not only are we addressing different bodies and needs in physically built environments, we are now addressing human needs and measurements on screen with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We have Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 1.0, and then we have 2.1. And we also have national corporations that are creating accessibility guides. IBM is one, Microsoft is another. And then here are some of the sample guidelines on screen. So when we think about human-centered design, the first step is focusing on the people you are designing for and with. And that starts with understanding measurements of the human body. So the Vitruvian Man, the ideal body size, circle, square, triangle. And then adding in human needs and behaviors with Henry Dreyfuss and Associates with human factors, anthropometrics, and ergonomics. And accommodations for differing abilities, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, Architecture and Equal Access to Independent Living, and beyond the built environment with Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, on-screen and online environments. So for class, what I would like you to do, besides bringing your Vitruvian Man measurements to class, what I'd like you to do is to create a list of objects that are impacted or influenced by the shape and grip of your hands. That can be anything. I'm going to give you 2 examples. 1, a doorknob. 2, a pen. Now, a doorknob and a pen, you cannot use those. You got to think up of something else. But create a list of objects that are impacted or influenced by the shape and grip of your hands. This should be pretty easy. Now, I know some of you are probably going to ask, how many do you want, Professor Ward? Bring in more than 5 examples. Bring in enough to where you can have a conversation with another classmate about that. And that should be good. Okay, so thank you for hanging in there and listening, and I look forward to seeing you in class.